thanks a lot for the intro. Very happy to be back to Lviv. And today I have kind of a heavy topic to talk about. And this is covering state management with Angular. So who is using it today? Just to have some feedback how deep I'm in trouble. Okay. Very good. Very good. I don't know if you have realized I spent some time in the cover. I like to add some animations, and I'm using some fancy animations here. I'm using some SVGs with filters. Probably nobody knows what I'm talking about, so I'm going to move. I'm going to move to the next slide. This is very important slide, okay? So this is my name. You know, I'm a very simple guy, and I wanted to remember my name. That's important. So that's the first slide. But let me just introduce myself a little bit. I mean, that was a crazy intro. I'm a Google developer expert, and this is something that you will see in different speakers. And usually you get this title from being active in the community, which is great. And just recently, last September, I celebrated my 3rd anniversary as a Google developer expert, and I did my 100th talk. Today is going to be my 102 talks. So that's quite a lot of talks. And I've done this the last 3 years, and this is quite active speaker that you have here. You will also see maybe some of my blogs. I blog around Angular and other technologies, but this is a special moment where you can see, like, in this Google Developers Experts publication in Medium, all of the feature blogs were mine. I didn't Photoshop this. I mean, it's easy, but I didn't do it. I also ran, as part of my intro, I was also very proud to run these 2 communities in London. One of them is around Angular. The other one is about GraphQL. You would be thinking, okay, GraphQL is a Facebook technology, but you are a Google developer expert. There's no conflict. We can cover any technologies. And actually, I would recommend you to look into GraphQL if you can. I'm also a trainer. You can see some happy students here. And I was pointing them with a gun. That's why. I started doing, because I'm doing this full-time for 3 years now. I don't have a job. I mean, don't ask me anything from a regular job. I'm just going to conferences. And I create these small demos. So it's not really, hard stuff. But I also started doing Master of Ceremonies, which is kind of fun. Because I'm on the stage, but I can make fun both of the speakers and the attendees. Take them to the stage, ask them, hard questions. Maybe I will do that with you. After I do the talk, ask you some heavy question. Just make you sweat. Okay, so I'm also happy to do some side projects. And I do mainly Angular, but I also do React because of GraphQL. And just recently, I started to play with Vue. And now I'm confident enough to do a training. This is going to be in January, and it's going to be in Hawaii. So I'm sure you are not going to Hawaii, but I just wanted to show you some cool things I'm doing. Maybe you know Chris. He's the CEO of Scotch.io. It's a tutorials website. And we also did another training some years ago. It was Angular in flip-flops. That was also quite cool. I'm also proud about this project that I started back in March. And this is a list where you can add women speakers. It works by recommendation. So if you know any woman in tech, you can go ahead, go into this list online. It's using Airtable. And you can register women speakers so conferences can then contact them and invite them to conferences. So let's start covering some fundamentals of ngrx. So ngrx is the state management library for Angular. And let me show you just some figures. So here we have the latest version. It was created in December 2015. So it's been around for a few years now. I would say that it's pretty much stable. There's a lot of contributions. There's also nice CLI integration. Maybe you haven't played around with it. It's using schematics. And it's a really nice way of creating your, setting up your ngrx for your app. Very easy. I want also to show you how, from where it comes. So ngrx was created after Redux, and Redux is kind of the initial library that was created to manage state for applications. And as you can see, there's no much difference. It was created slightly before, but it has much more support. You can see that there's many contributors as stars on GitHub. And if we look at some other libraries that has been appearing after ngrx, probably the most popular is ngrx. And this was just created earlier this year. And it has already quite a lot of support from the community. You can see there's a lot of contributions. And one of the things that they are trying to do is try to make ngrx less bulky. So you don't have to write so much code, and you can use some decorators, you can use some techniques to make that easier, although changing a little bit of the fundamentals. So this is a little bit of an overview of all the technologies around the state management. So as an overview, ngrx is a state management library. I would say it's the de facto one. If you are going to start a project today, I would recommend you to use it. It's inspired by Redux. And there's also a tight integration with RxJS. So if you already are using RxJS in your project, that will be a good match for you. As I was explaining, it's well integrated with the CLI. So you can run some commands to set up your project. You can add, initialize your store, and also add all of the bits and pieces that you will require. So that's really nice. I prepared this diagram, and you can see for the first time the grumpy cat. I don't know if you recognize the grumpy cat here in Ukraine. He's not happy. He's not happy about anything. He's not excited. I hope you are not a grumpy developer. Are you grumpy developers? I hope you are not. But that represents how he is excited about ngrx store. But I'm really excited about it, and I'm going to cover all the data flow. So we are going to start on the view. That will be the first step. So there will be some user interaction. It's going to start on the view, and that's going to trigger an action. As you can see on the right side, we have two streams. As I was explaining, ngrx is based on RxJS. And these two streams will control two things. One will be the actions being triggered by the user or the system, and the store, which will be the different states created by the different actions. So we got the action now on the first stream. That's going to go into the store, and here some magic happens. So we have a reducer, which is going to take the last state and create the new state. That will go into the second observable. So as long as you control these two observables, you will be in control of ngrx. So I would say that it's pretty simple system. Once we have the new state, we refresh the view with the new data. And that will be the whole cycle of ngrx store. Of course, if we trigger another action, you can guess what will be the behavior. We get the action on the stream of actions, and that will then create a new state, and so on and so forth. So one of the benefits of using ngrx is that it's easy to predict what will happen in this system. So if you have new developers joining the team, they will learn this cycle, and they can use this cycle over the development cycle as well. And that will be making mostly development and debugging easier. So this is another diagram, and it's going to go over the different steps just to try to memorize it and get used to it. So we're starting from the component, and this component will have some view, some controls that the user can interact. Once the user triggers some action that will come next, the component will dispatch the action. So it's now the store controlling this logic. And then from there, that will match a reducer. So we always have to match these actions with a reducer that will trigger the logic behind that action, that interaction from the user. That's going, as we know, is going to create a new state. And that state, then, it will notify the components that subscribe to that state stream, that's state observable, and will be able to refresh the view. So that's kind of an overview now in a different diagram. One thing that you get when you use ngrx is, besides the store, you get a set of packages. And that's also why people start talking about ngrx platform, not just the store. And we can see some of these features. So we always start with the store. That will be the main feature that we are going to use. But that comes with some other packages. Mostly when we are dealing with server-side logic, we are going to use asynchronous actions that come together with these ngrx effects. Then we can also integrate, if we use the router in our application, we can also have an integration package that will synchronize the state of the router with our store. That will come with this ngrx router store. And if we are dealing with large data sets, we can also use ngrx entity that will make the performance, will improve the performance of our store. This goes into some more detail. Now I'm talking about probably thousands of rows. If you are dealing with this such amount of data on your client, then you will start looking into these alternative packages. One thing that happens is usually people will start using arrays. And arrays will have some limitations on performance. So this is an alternative to arrays, and is a known limitation from JavaScript. But you don't have to worry that much. You can introduce this package and get the benefits right away. Some other packages that you will need is the DevTools. The DevTools are exactly the same DevTools that you have in Redux. So we can leverage the ecosystem created for Redux, and it's totally fully compatible with ngrx. And then finally, I think this is also important. We are seeing more and more features being built on top of schematics, and this helps two things. This helps helping you setting up your project, but also scaffolding all of the different files and giving you best practices. And this is really important when you are working in a large team. You don't need to be up to date. You don't need to follow, the latest trends. You will get these best practices from the Angular CLI, which is probably what you are doing today anyway. But it's good to know that using ngrx is also using all the ecosystem coming from Angular CLI. The first example is very simple. I'm going to use the counter example. It's also in the docs, and because the theme of this conference was also around cats, I decided to use this image. He's the counter. He's counting money, He's probably a freelance, an Angular freelance. And this is the application I will be building. So you can see we have these different UI components. So we have the total, and then we have some big buttons, for the cat to use. So we have increment, we have the decrement, and I also added this feature which will reset the counter. So that's what we are aiming for. And I'm going to use this as a really simple example so we can use ngrx with it. So going back to this diagram, I'm going to start looking, developing the actions for this system. So here we can see, let me get this a little bit smaller. Okay. So now we can see the whole screen. So that will go into, if you look at the folder structure, we are creating a folder for the actions. So that will get all of the counter actions in a separate file. And we can see that we are importing the action from the ngrx store. That will give us some properties on this action object that we want to create. And one of the first best practices that we are going to use with ngrx is create this enum of the different action types. And the first one I'm going to look into is the increment. So that was the first option in our UI. You can also see that we are using some best practices. We are using this counter and then increment. That's going to give you an overview. That's for the dev tools. So every time that we trigger this action, we are going to see this message on the dev tools. And that will serve two purposes. One will be to be able to track the different actions that the user is doing. And the other thing will be for new developers to explore the solution. So don't forget about this. A lot of the features coming from ngrx, they improve the developer experience. And this is one bit of that. The next thing that we are going to do is create the class. This is the actual action. And we are going to use the enum, which was the action type. And we are going to use some basic TypeScript features. So I'm going to use read-only, so we cannot change the type once we created the action. And then I'm also going to export the action so I can use it on the reducer. I'm going also to use this animated GIF. I'm going to demonstrate some code. And actually, I'm going to create a new instance of this action class that I just shown you. So that will create just a simple object literal in JavaScript. So this is what we created with this increment action. Just an object with a type, and we have the description that we use in the enum. So I hope that's easy enough to follow. The next thing I want to show you is the reducer. So the reducer will be responsible to create the new states once we trigger an action. So how we are going to do that is we are going to use this signature that takes the latest state and takes the action that was triggered and creates the new state. So let's demonstrate this code with some demo. What I'm going to do, the reducer is just a function, as you can see, and I'm going to emulate the bootstrap. So this is exactly when you run ngrx for the first time. This is the first execution. The first argument will be undefined. We didn't have any previous state for our application, so that's going to be undefined. And if you see the signature of the function, you can see that we have some default parameter in there. So it's going to take the value 0. Remember that this is a counter, so that will be the initial value for the counter. Then the next will be the action, which is the bootstrap for ngrx store. And in ngrx, it's add ngrx store init. So that will create the first state. It will go into this switch and use the default branch. That will be returning the value 0. Of course, we can set the initial state to be any other value, but that makes sense for our counter. The next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna trigger a user action, which will be the action increment that we just created. And it will go into the first branch of this switch and just use the state which was the last state, which was 0, and increment it by 1. So that will just implement the logic that we wanted. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to extend this system. Obviously, decrement will be very similar to increment, so I'm going to skip that. And I'm going to look into reset. Reset is going to take an argument, and you are going to be able to set the value that you want to reset to. So we are going to follow the same approach. We are going to create a new entry on the enum. Then I'm going to create a new class. This is going to handle the reset. And as you can see, I added a constructor. That constructor is now taking a payload and just taking the value of that reset value. That will increase, the actions that my store has. And now I have both the increment and the reset. So just I'm incrementally adding new features. What you will see here is now I have one argument that it's an object with the property value, and then I can decide if I want to reset to 0 or any other value. This will be decided by the component, so now it's a little bit more flexible. If I create a counter reset action, that will create an object literal now with that type and payload. So that's what actually is going to be created and sent to the store. So let's go to the next step. So now I added the reset action. I need to go and create the logic that will handle that action. So as we did before with the increment, I'm going to demonstrate the code with a little demo. And I'm going to use some current state. So now the counter is in a state with the value 42. And I'm going to reset it with value 0. So that's going to go into the first branch and just use the value that was on the payload. As you can see, I'm using the value from the action in this case. Very good. So how we deal with these changes on the different components? We have covered all the different aspects of this store. We have triggered the actions that has triggered the code in the reducers and created the different states. Basically now what I'm going to show you is how we trigger these actions from the component and how we refresh the view. That's the last bit. So for this, I'm going to show this very simple component. We have on the template, we have this matching this binding with the different events that are happening in this application counter. And this is a technique that is called container. So now I'm showing you a component that is acting as a container, and it's just taking the events coming from the component and just binding them straight to the store. As you can see, the code is very concise, and you can follow the code here with the methods on the component. So basically, I'm just triggering, coming from the events of the component, and then triggering, dispatching these different actions. As you can see now, you can see these all two things happening. And you can also imagine how you would change the reset to be a different value. You can also bind it, for example, with a property in your view. In this case, I'm just using the default value of 0. So how we refresh the view? We are going to use just subscribe. We are going to subscribe to this value on the state. And in order to do that, we are going to use the select API. So from the store, we can call select, and that will give us access to this callback that will take the value from the state and pick which property we want to bind. Then I can use that property and use it as you use usually with observables with this async pipe. Another interesting thing that you can see here is I'm passing this value down to a property in this app counter. This is still the container, but I'm going to show you how this app counter is using the presentational pattern. So let's look into that into more detail. It's also nice to recognize here that I'm not passing the observable, but the value that comes from the observable, which is the total. This is also a very rough approach. So I'm just using a simple state binding, and that's not a best practice. So I'm going to go back into this a little bit later. So for the counter component, you can see how we are using this change detection strategy on push that will make this component only refresh when we change the inputs and the outputs of the component. You can also see how I bind the events coming from user interaction into a bubbling up to the container. And that makes for a really nice code. You can also see how I binded the total into this template. Okay. So we covered everything but the state. So let's see how we can set the state for this counter. The way it works with ngrx is we create an interface, and then by using this action reduce map, we can use that interface to type this counter which will match with a reducer. So now we have the whole ngrx setup. We match the counter with the reducer, and that will trigger the different logic at the right times. So how we set up ngrx on the root module? It's very easy. We just need to use the for root. This will be for the root module, and we can just pass the reducers as the first argument. One nice thing of the integration with schematics is that this can be done by the Angular CLI. So it's really nice. You don't have to memorize this. You can just run Angular CLI to get this set up. So now we have covered a simple example of the counter. There's one technique that not many people use in Angular, and in this section I'm going to introduce how you can reuse reducers. And this is a technique that I learned from Redux, and it's a nice simple technique. So for example, when you have multiple usages of one of the store that you created, you can then have multiple instances and they will work independently. So in our example, that will be having more than one counter. So you can imagine in your application, you may have several grids or several UI components, and you don't want to be creating all of the actions, reducers, etc., etc. You just want to create one version of the code and then be able to reuse it everywhere in your application. So yeah, that's exciting. Very good. So how the single counter worked? So this is how it worked. We had a state with the counter. We had an interaction that triggered that action. We created this action in our component that incremented the counter, and that is how we implemented the initial counter. If we want to use multiple counters, we have the first problem is identifying which counter we trigger the action. So we need to identify the different counters. Let's say we use an index. So we use counter 1, counter 2. How that will work in our state? Well, it's easy. We just need to get different entries in our state that will match these IDs. And then when we trigger one of these actions, we will tell the store which counter was by using the payload. So I'm going to use this target property so I can figure it out for which counter it was. You can extend this to any number of counters once you apply this technique. So how that works on the setup? So the thing that we will have to do is extend our interface and use this name reducer function. This is a meta reducer, so it returns a reducer. And as you can see, I'm using the original implementation. I'm not using two different reducers. I'm just using the original reducer and telling what's the ID, what's the target. So it's a very neat technique. And this is the code that you can use for any reducers. So here you can see with this demo, I demonstrate how you can use it. Well, the first thing is how I show you the code before. I'm using the original reducer and then the ID, the target counter that we want to trigger that action. So that's going to return the new reducer. So this is a meta reducer, a function that returns a reducer. And This is just looking like a normal reducer, but inside I'm looking into this target. So if the target in the payload is not set, I'm just going to return the last state. So it's going to be neutral. It's not going to do any change. It's just going to ignore that action. But if it matches, then I'm going to run that reducer. So depending on the target, is going to run that action only for that target. So that looks more or less like this in the object at the bottom. And you get that extra feature. One thing that we didn't cover before is selectors, so I want to cover that in more detail. And selectors is a little bit of an unknown area. People just use the basic select from the store, and they don't realize the implications on performance and also in architecture and maintenance. So I'm going to cover that. And there are two types of selectors. One I call property selectors, and the other one I call computed selectors. So I'm going to look into the property selectors, and these are probably the more used. Probably you are using these right now. So these are helpers to get access to the different properties of the store. This will help you to avoid tie coupling. So this is when you introduce changes on your store, you don't want to be changing the components. And that's something that I'm going to show you how that works. Another thing that you want from property selectors is to be together with the reducers. So when you are developing a complex applications, you can find the selectors together with the reducers. So how that works? If we use simple selectors, these selectors will be right on the component. So that will look something like this code here. We have the store select, and then we have a function that will just pick the property on our store. But that makes this code very brittle. Every time that I change the property on the state, I need to go back to the component and make that change. How we can improve that? Well, if we introduce the selectors, we are not using that tightly coupling. I'm using a function that will hire this logic, this information from the components. So now the components are safe. If I change, for example, the property that I'm accessing, and I'm changing it for another one, this small change won't affect the components. Imagine you have a complex system with hundreds of components. You don't need to change these components, not even go to the template and change the code there, because the selector is handling that for you. So that's a small change that will improve maintenance. How that code looks. For a property selector, this is the code that you will be using. You are just taking the state and selecting a property of that set state. You can use simple properties or different types. So for example, it could be an array, it could be a more complex type that you can use as a selector, but that's going to be some code like these examples. If we look into computed selectors, these are more interesting. We can use some of these properties to calculate new properties that we didn't have on the original state. And this will be using these two APIs. So one is for create selector, for the root store, and the other one is when we have modules, when we have feature modules. In that case, we will use this create feature selector. One thing that we are using with selector is memoization, and I'm going to dip a little bit deeper later, but that's also a concept that you should familiarize yourself. So how we use this is the same as we did with selectors. We are going to create our computed selectors along with the reducers, so we can do the changes together. So here, let me show you an example of this. So if we have a to-do list, and we have this example with just one to-do, this will be how our state will look. So we have a to-do array, and we have few fields giving us the ID, some text, and then a flag knowing if the to-do was complete or not. And then we have some filter that will help us select the different types of tasks. If we have this store and we have different components showing this list, we will realize soon that we need more, we need different arrays. And in this setup, we are showing this to do because it's still not done. If I change the filter, and now I want to see only the completed to-dos, now I need to show a different list on my component, but my store still needs to be the same. So this, as you can see, we need two different arrays. If I do a binding with the array on the store, it won't work. So I need to create some intermediate structure. What I will do is create a selector for this. Let's see how we fix that. What we will do is create two selector properties, and then create this computer selector that will take these two previous selectors and then create a projector, what is called a projector. So this projector, how it will work? Well, it takes the result of the previous selectors, and this is calling the selector with the state, as we know, and then running the logic that we want to achieve. In our case, we want to run the filter through the array. We can also do some refactoring, so it's a little bit nicer, but this is actually how it looks. So we are going to pass the original array, pass the filter, and then use that filter to combine the two. So this is actually the code. You can see how you can use multiple properties in your state to create a new property. This is how this will work. So now you can see this in action. Here you can see now I'm not using a function taking the state and returning a property from the state. I'm using a selector. And this selector now is a combination of the two property selectors that I introduced before. So you can see you can take this a step further. If you want to use this in a feature module, that will look slightly different. And I took an example from the ngrx website, and this is then a different branch. So now I'm using books, which is from the root that will be not on the actual root, but it will be on the books branch. And then from there, it will have a separate store. So it will act as is an independent store. So in that case, the setup changes slightly. So we need to tell ngrx what branch is handling. So it's not handling from the root, it's now one of the branches. So now this books branch, it will be just one level down. You can extend this any number of levels. Don't think that you are limited to just one branch. You can go down any number of lines and create all of the different architectures that you want for your system. So one thing that it's left is memoization. That's kind of JavaScript on steroids. So I'm going to try to cover it very quickly. This comes from machine learning. It targets improvement of performance for repetitive calls, and this is exactly the setup we have with ngrx. And it just uses internal cache to make these results available faster. Usually ngrx has one slot, which can be a little bit constraining, and you can extend that by using some external libraries. I'm going to show you a demo because I don't have that much time. Let's see if I can show you. So this is the code that you can then try later. This is just creating a custom create selector. You can see it here. I'm using an external library. It's called Moise, and it's giving me some options for how long the results are in the cache, and I can also say how many values I want in the cache. So here, this is the output. Maybe you can try later, but basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to catch these different filters. So now when I'm going from filter to filter, you can see that there's some calculations happening. This is just applying the filter to the original array, but now because I use all of these filters, you can see that there's no more traces of these calculations. So these are now catch. So you can get like really good performance improvements. You can see the demo code later. It's just this small snippet here. You create this custom selector, and then you just need to call it replacing the default ngrx selector. So let's see what's the change. If I use the default ngrx selector, the main issue is like now every time that I navigate, I'm doing the calculations all the time. So depending on how large is your data set, that can be a big issue. So let's go back to the slides very quickly. Let me just jump this. So if you want to know more, you can follow some of the people working in the ngrx core team. There's also some other contributors in the community that I recommend you to follow and get a little bit more details on this. So thanks a lot. Thanks for listening. That's all.